My name is Renee, and I want to tell you about the day I realized that the two people I loved most in this world had been lying to my face for 3 years straight. Not strangers, not coworkers, not some woman I'd never met. My husband and my cousin. The cousin who was in my wedding, who helped me pick my dress, who held my hand when I was nervous walking down that aisle, and whispered in my ear that Marcus was the luckiest man alive. She knew. Even then, standing beside me in that church, she already knew. And so did he. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because if I'm going to tell you this story the right way, I need to take you back to where it started. Not the day I found out, not the day everything fell apart. I need to take you back to the beginning, when life still looked exactly the way I thought it was supposed to look. I grew up in Atlanta, South Side, the kind of neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, where your mama's friends were your aunties, whether they were blood or not, and where family meant everything. I was raised by a woman who sacrificed every single comfort she had to make sure I never felt like I was missing anything. My mother, Doris, worked 2 jobs my entire childhood. Days at a laundry service, evenings cleaning offices downtown. She never complained, not once. She just handled it, quietly, the way strong women do. I learned everything about dignity from watching her. I had one cousin I was close to growing up, Tanya. She was 6 months older than me, and we were more like sisters than cousins. We grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same school, shared clothes and secrets and dreams the way only girls who truly trust each other can. When I got my first heartbreak at 17, it was Tanya who stayed up with me all night. When she got into a car accident at 20 and was scared she might lose her leg, I was the one sleeping in that hospital chair every night for 2 weeks. That was who we were to each other. When I met Marcus, I introduced him to Tanya before I introduced him to my own mother. That's how much she meant to me. That's how much I trusted her. Marcus came into my life when I was 26. I was working as an office manager at a mid-size logistics company. He was a contractor who came in to oversee some renovation work on our building. The first time I saw him, he was standing in the hallway with a hard hat in his hand, laughing at something one of his workers said. And I remember thinking he had the kind of laugh that made a room feel warmer just by being in it. He noticed me too. He asked me to dinner 3 days later, nervous, fumbling a little with his words, which I found charming because everything else about him seemed so self-assured. We went to a restaurant downtown. We talked for 4 hours. He walked me to my car and shook my hand at the end of the night, which made me laugh, and he said he was trying to be respectful. I drove home smiling in a way I hadn't smiled in years. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Solid years. Years where I felt seen and chosen and loved in the way I had always quietly hoped I would be. He met my mother and she adored him. He came to family cookouts and held his own with my uncles, laughed with my aunties, helped clean up without being asked. He was the kind of man you brought home and everybody exhaled. Tanya loved him too. From the very first time I brought him around, she was warm with him, welcoming, genuinely happy for me, or so I believed. We got married on a Saturday in October. It was a small wedding by some people's standards, about 120 guests, outdoor ceremony, tent reception, string lights and sunflowers because that's what I'd always wanted. Tanya was my maid of honor. She gave a speech that made half the room cry, including me. She talked about how long she'd watched me wait for the right person, how she'd prayed for this day, how Marcus was everything she could have hoped for me. Every single word of that speech was a lie, but I didn't know that then. Then I was just a woman in a white dress, surrounded by the people she loved, stepping into what she believed was the rest of her life. Marcus and I bought a house together 8 months after the wedding, a 4-bedroom in a quiet suburb outside Atlanta. More house than we needed at the time, but we talked about filling it eventually. We talked about children. He wanted 2, I wanted 3. We compromised on 2 and laughed about it. We had a guest room that Tanya used so often it basically became hers. She had a key. She knew where everything was. She was as comfortable in my home as I was. I want you to really understand that. She had a key to my house. The first year of marriage was good. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but genuinely good. We had our adjustments, the way every couple does. Marcus worked long hours sometimes, construction contracts being what they are. I had my own pressures at work, but we communicated, we made time for each other. We had a date night every Thursday that we protected like it was sacred. I thought we were building something real. The second year, things shifted. Slightly at first. So slightly, I almost didn't notice. Marcus started working later. Not every night, but more nights than before. He was more distracted at home, more likely to be on his phone, more likely to step out of the room to take calls. I noticed, the way a woman always notices, but I told myself I was being paranoid. He was running his own business. Stress was part of that. I didn't want to be the wife who questioned everything, who made him feel surveilled in his own home. So I said nothing. I watched, and I waited, and I told myself I was imagining it. Tanya was around a lot during that period. Looking back, I understand exactly why, but at the time her presence felt like comfort. She'd come by on weekends, bring food, sit with me in the kitchen while Marcus was out somewhere handling business. She'd ask me how things were going, how Marcus and I were doing, whether everything felt okay. I told her what I told myself, that things were good, just a little stressful, nothing to worry about. She listened to every word, and she took all of it back to him. The third year was when the cracks got too big to explain away. Marcus was pulling away emotionally in a way that was impossible to ignore. He was present in the house, but absent from me. Conversations felt shorter. Intimacy felt obligatory. There was a distance between us that I couldn't close no matter how hard I tried. And I tried. I suggested counseling. He said we didn't need it, that everything was fine, that I was overthinking. I asked him directly one night if there was someone else. He looked me in the eyes and told me no. He seemed almost offended that I'd asked. I believed him. That is the part that took me the longest to forgive myself for. Not that I was deceived, anyone can be deceived, but that I believed him when every single instinct I had was screaming at me not to. The moment everything unraveled started with something small. It always does, doesn't it? It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had come home from work early because I had a migraine that was making it impossible to sit in front of the screen. I let myself in quietly, went straight upstairs to take something for the pain and lie down. Marcus wasn't supposed to be home. He had a job site across town that was supposed to run until at least 6. His truck was not in the driveway, so I had no reason to think anything was wrong. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard a sound from the guest room, a small sound, the kind of sound that stops your feet before your brain even processes why. I stood on those stairs for what felt like a full minute, not moving, not breathing, every hair on my body standing up. And then I walked to that guest room door, and I opened it. I don't need to describe in detail what I saw. You already know. You knew when I told you Tanya had a key. What I will tell you is that the 2 seconds after I opened that door were the strangest of my life, because the first thing I felt was not rage. It was not even pain. It was something almost like recognition. Like some part of me had always known this was coming, and had simply been waiting for the moment to arrive. And then Tanya turned around. And what I remember most, more than anything else, is that she didn't even look sorry. She looked caught. Those are not the same thing. I closed the door. I walked back down the stairs. I went into the kitchen, and I sat down at my own kitchen table in my own house, and I stayed very, very still. Neither of them came downstairs for 11 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the microwave the entire time. 11 minutes for them to figure out what to say to the woman they had both just destroyed. When they finally came down, Marcus started talking immediately, words pouring out of him, explanation and apology and excuse layered on top of each other in a way that told me he had been rehearsing for this conversation for a long time. He just hadn't expected to need it today. I let him talk. I didn't say a word. I looked at him the way you look at something you're trying to memorize before it disappears. Tanya stood behind him and said nothing. She didn't look at me. When Marcus finally ran out of words and the silence stretched out long enough to become unbearable, I stood up from that table, picked up my purse, and walked out of my own house. I drove to my mother's. I didn't cry on the way there. I didn't cry when I got there either. My mother took one look at my face and opened her arms, and I sat in her kitchen, and I told her everything, and she held me, and she didn't say a word for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said, "Baby, the way they did this tells you everything about who they are. And the way you handle it from here will tell you everything about who you are." I decided that night what kind of woman I was going to be. Not the kind who falls apart. Not the kind who begs or pleads or makes scenes. Not the kind who lets two people who betrayed her walk away without feeling the full weight of what they did. I was going to be the kind of woman who takes her time, who thinks, who plans, who wins. I stayed at my mother's house for 3 days. I did not respond to Marcus's calls or texts. I did not respond to Tanya's single message, which said only, "I'm sorry, Renee. I never meant for this." I read that message once, set my phone down, and did not pick it up again for 6 hours. On the 4th day, I called a lawyer. Not a divorce lawyer yet, a family law attorney I found through a colleague who had been through her own divorce 2 years prior. I needed to understand exactly what I was entitled to, exactly what the legal landscape looked like before I made a single move. What I learned in that meeting changed the direction of everything. Marcus and I had bought that house together. We were both on the deed, but the down payment had come almost entirely from me, from savings I had accumulated before the marriage, money my mother had helped me put away since I was a teenager. In Georgia, how separate property is handled in a divorce depends significantly on how it was managed during the marriage. My attorney walked me through every detail. She was thorough and she was honest, and she told me that if I moved carefully, I was in a strong position. I also learned something else that week, something I had not expected to find. Marcus had a business, a construction company he had built over the past 8 years. It was incorporated, had employees, had contracts. During our marriage, I had done something that at the time felt like simply being a supportive wife. I had helped him with the administrative side of the business. Bookkeeping, contract organization, client communication when he was on site. I had never taken a salary for it. I had done it because I loved him and I wanted his business to succeed. My attorney looked at the documentation I brought her and was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at me and said, "You have contributed materially and documentably to the growth of this business during your marriage. That matters." I walked out of that office with a very different understanding of my situation than I had walked in with. I want to be clear about something. What I did next was not about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was not about making Marcus suffer simply because I was in pain. It was about making sure that a woman who had given 3 years of her life, her home, her trust, and her unpaid labor to a man and a marriage that were built on deception, walked away with everything she was rightfully owed. Not a penny more, but absolutely not a penny less. I went back to the house while Marcus was at work. I packed what I needed systematically. Documents first, every financial record I could find, tax returns, bank statements, business records that I had organized myself and therefore knew exactly where to locate. Then personal items, then the things my mother had given me that had been in my family for years. I left his things exactly as they were. I left my key on the kitchen counter, and I left a single note on the table that said, "You'll be hearing from my attorney." I have thought a lot about what it means to be a woman who keeps her composure when everything inside her is on fire. People see the stillness and they think you're not feeling anything. They see the dry eyes and they think you're cold. They see the measured steps and the quiet voice and the way you move through a room without breaking down, and they think something must be wrong with you. That a normal woman would be screaming by now. That the absence of visible pain means the absence of real pain. They are wrong. What composure actually is when you're living inside it is the most exhausting thing a human being can do. It is the act of taking every wave of grief and rage and humiliation that crashes into you. And they crash constantly. They crash at 3 a.m. when you wake up reaching for someone who is not there. They crash when you see a couple laughing in a restaurant. They crash when a song comes on that you danced to at your own wedding, and redirecting every single one of those waves into something useful, something purposeful, something that serves you instead of consuming you. That is what I did for the weeks that followed. I stayed at my mother's house. Her name was Doris, and she was 61 years old, and she had seen enough of life to know when to talk and when to simply be present. She was present. She made food I didn't always eat, and left it on the counter for when I was ready. She kept the television on low in the evenings, so the silence didn't get too heavy. She did not ask me questions I wasn't ready to answer, and she did not offer opinions I hadn't asked for. And she did not once say anything negative about Marcus in my presence, because she understood, without being told, that I needed to process this on my own timeline and in my own way. My mother is the strongest person I have ever known. Everything I did in the months that followed, every decision I made with clarity, when I could have made it with emotion, I owe to her. Not because she told me what to do, but because 30 years of watching her handle hardship with grace had built something in me that I didn't fully understand I had until I needed it. Marcus called every day for the first 2 weeks, sometimes twice a day. I did not answer. He left voicemails that evolved over time in a way that I found genuinely revealing. The first messages were apologetic, stumbling, emotional, full of "I'm sorry," and "please let me explain," and "I never wanted to hurt you." The tone of a man who believed that if he could just get me on the phone, he could talk his way back into my good graces, the way he had talked his way out of difficult situations his entire life. When the apologetic calls didn't work, he shifted. The messages became more measured, more careful. He started talking about the house, about finances, about wanting to handle things amicably and fairly. The tone of a man who had started thinking about what this was going to cost him. When those calls didn't produce a response either, something changed again. He stopped calling every day. The calls became less frequent, spaced further apart, and when they did come, they were shorter, more businesslike. The tone of a man who had hired his own attorney. I had been expecting that. I was ready for it. My attorney's name was Patricia Owens. She was 54 years old, had been practicing family law in Georgia for 26 years, and had the kind of quiet, precise energy that told you immediately she was someone who won not by being louder than the other side, but by being more prepared. She wore her hair natural, kept her office immaculate, and had a framed quote on her wall behind her desk that said, "The most powerful position you can be in is the one your opponent underestimated you into." I liked her from the moment I walked into her office. Over the course of several meetings, Patricia and I built a complete picture of the marriage's financial landscape. Every joint account, every individual account, the house, its current market value, the mortgage balance, the down payment I had contributed, and the documentation proving it was sourced from premarital savings. My unpaid contributions to Marcus's business, which Patricia referred to as substantial and documentable. There was something else Patricia found when she started examining the business records I had brought her. Something I had not noticed when I was organizing those records as a faithful wife who trusted her husband and wasn't looking for anything to be wrong. A pattern of cash withdrawals. Not enormous amounts individually, but consistent, regular, going back further than I expected. Patricia laid the bank statements out on her desk and walked me through the timeline. The withdrawals had started approximately 22 months into our marriage. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here, a few hundred there. Then they became more regular, monthly, sometimes twice monthly, amounts that were large enough to matter but small enough to stay below the threshold that might have caught my attention if I had been looking. I sat in Patricia's office, and I looked at that timeline, and I did the math in my head, and I felt something move through me that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but was something colder and more clarifying than either. 22 months into our marriage. Tanya had started coming around more often at around the 23-month mark. I remembered it clearly now because I had thought at the time that she was going through a difficult period. She had mentioned trouble with a man she was seeing, some vague unhappiness she never fully explained. And I had been glad she had somewhere comfortable to land. I had been glad she had us. I had been glad she had him. I looked at Patricia and I said, "How far back does this go exactly?" And Patricia looked at me steadily and said, "Renee, based on what I'm looking at here, I believe this began earlier than you know." She was right. What we pieced together over the following weeks, through financial records and phone records that became available through the discovery process once legal proceedings began, was a timeline that rearranged everything I thought I knew about the last 3 years of my life. Marcus and Tanya had not begun their involvement in the second year of my marriage, as I had assumed when I found them. They had begun it in the first year, specifically approximately 4 months after my wedding. 4 months after she stood beside me in a church and watched me make vows to a man she had already decided she wanted for herself. 4 months. I have sat with that number many times since then. I have turned it over, examined it from different angles, tried to find the frame in which it becomes less devastating. I have not found that frame. Some things are exactly as terrible as they appear to be, and this was one of them. What Marcus had been doing with those cash withdrawals was funding a parallel life. Not elaborate. He was not a man of complicated schemes. He was a man of simple appetites and convenient opportunities. The money had gone toward things that left no joint account paper trail. Meals. Hotel rooms on nights when he claimed to be working late on job sites that were, I later confirmed, sites where work had finished hours before he came home. Small gifts. The ordinary squalid economy of deception. Tanya, for her part, had not been passive in this arrangement. Phone records showed consistent communication between them, not just the kind of contact that would be normal between a man and his wife's cousin, but a volume and frequency that told a story of its own. They had been careful mostly, but not careful enough. Because careful people do not get caught the way they got caught, in a guest room in the middle of the afternoon, in the house of the woman they were both supposed to love. Patricia presented all of this to me over the course of 3 meetings, laying it out methodically, professionally, without editorializing. She was not there to be angry on my behalf. She was there to make sure I was fully armed with the truth before we walked into any room with the other side. When she finished, she asked me how I was doing, not as a lawyer, as a person. She looked at me for a moment in a way that suggested she had sat across from enough women in my position to know that fine was rarely the whole truth. But she nodded and moved forward because she also understood that sometimes fine is the thing you need to be in order to get through what comes next. What came next was a mediation session. Marcus's attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the energy of someone who had built his career on making reasonable women feel unreasonable, proposed mediation as a way to settle things without going to litigation. Patricia advised me to agree, not because she thought we would reach an agreement in mediation, but because she wanted to see what their opening position was. She wanted to understand how Marcus had framed the situation to his own attorney. She wanted to watch how he behaved when he was in a room with me. I agreed. I want to tell you about the morning of that mediation session, about what it felt like to put on a suit in my mother's house, to stand in front of her bathroom mirror and look at myself, to take a full breath and decide exactly who I was going to be when I walked into that room. I wore a gray suit, simple, well-fitted, the kind of outfit that says I am not here to perform emotion for you. I pulled my hair back. I wore small gold earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. I put on the particular kind of stillness that had been building in me for weeks, settled it around myself like armor, and I drove downtown. Patricia met me in the lobby. She looked at me, gave a single nod of approval, and we went upstairs. Marcus was already in the conference room when we arrived. He was seated across the table with Gerald Fitch beside him, a stack of folders arranged neatly in front of them. Marcus was wearing a suit I had helped him pick out for a client meeting 2 years ago. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well. When I walked in, he looked up, and something crossed his face that I did not expect. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated, something that looked, if I had to name it, like the expression of a man who is only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he has done. I sat down. I looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then I looked at Patricia, and I did not look at Marcus again for the rest of that session unless I was specifically required to address something he said. Gerald Fitch opened with what he clearly believed was a reasonable position. He framed the marriage as a partnership that had simply run its course. He talked about equitable distribution with the kind of practiced reasonableness that was clearly designed to make me feel that anything more than what they were offering would be overreach on my part. He proposed a split that would have given me the house, with the full remaining mortgage, a portion of the joint savings, and a clean break with no claim on the business. I watched Patricia make a small note on her legal pad. I had learned to read her notes. That particular note meant, interesting opening, let them keep talking. Gerald talked for a while. Marcus said almost nothing. At one point Marcus started to speak. and Gerald put a hand on his arm in a way that stopped him mid-sentence. Marcus sat back. He looked at his hands. When Gerald finished, Patricia let the silence sit for a moment, in the way that very skilled people sometimes do, letting it stretch just long enough to signal that she was not remotely unsettled by anything she had just heard. Then she opened her own folder. She walked through what we had, methodically, the financial records, the timeline of the cash withdrawals, the documented history of my unpaid contributions to the business, specific dates, specific tasks, specific communications with clients that bore my name, and demonstrated my direct role in growing the company's revenue during the marriage. She put a finger on the table for the business valuation contribution. It was not a small figure. She did not raise her voice once. She did not editorialize. She did not frame any of it as punishment or as retribution. She simply presented it as fact. By the time she finished, Gerald Fitch's practiced reasonableness had acquired a slightly different quality. Marcus had stopped looking at his hands and was staring at the table in front of him, with an expression I can only describe as a man watching the floor disappear beneath his feet. Patricia closed her folder and said, "My client is prepared to proceed to litigation if a satisfactory agreement is not reached today. She is also prepared to make the business valuation a central issue in those proceedings." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "We'd like to take a short recess and give your client an opportunity to consult with you." We stepped out into the hallway. Patricia stood beside me and said nothing. I stood with my back straight and my hands quiet at my sides, and I breathed. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When we went back in, Gerald Fitch's entire posture had changed. The confident framing of the opening position was gone. What replaced it was the particular carefulness of a lawyer who has just had a conversation with his client that significantly altered his understanding of the case he was defending. They made a new offer. I won't walk you through every number, because this isn't about numbers. But I will tell you this: what Marcus agreed to in that conference room, by the end of that session, bore almost no resemblance to what Gerald Fitch had confidently put on the table 3 hours earlier. The house was handled, the savings were handled, and a portion of the business, my portion, the portion that Patricia had documented and valued and presented with the kind of precision that left very little room for argument, was addressed in a way that reflected the actual contribution I had made. I signed documents that afternoon that I will not describe in detail, because they are mine, and because some things a woman keeps for herself. What I will say is that I walked out of that building in the gray suit with the gold earrings, and I stood on the sidewalk in the Atlanta afternoon sun, and I breathed the particular kind of breath that comes when something long and heavy has finally lifted. Patricia stood beside me and said, "You did well in there." I said, "We did well." She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile. It suited her. "I want to talk about Tanya now, because I know you've been waiting for that part of the story. And I want to be honest about how complicated that part was, and is, and probably always will be. With Marcus, it was painful, but it was ultimately simple. He was my husband. He broke a vow. The relationship had a legal structure, and that legal structure gave me a framework for accountability and resolution. It was devastating, but it was navigable. Tanya was different, because what Tanya and I had did not have a legal framework. There was no document that described what she owed me, no court that could quantify what she took. What she took was not property. What she took was the particular kind of trust that you only give to someone you have loved your entire life, someone you grew up beside, someone who knows your oldest wounds and your deepest fears and your most private self, and who uses that knowledge not to protect you, but to position herself closer to the thing she wants. For the first several weeks after finding them, I did not think about Tanya much. I was focused on the legal process, on what needed to be done, on getting through each day. My mother never mentioned her. My other family members, those who knew what had happened, followed my mother's lead and didn't either. But Tanya was not silent. She sent messages. Not many, but consistent. Not daily. She was smart enough to understand that daily messages would be unwelcome and might be used against her in some way she couldn't predict. But regularly. Every week or so, a message would arrive. Some of them were short. Things like, "I know you don't want to hear from me right now, but I need you to know I'm sorry." Some of them were longer, explaining or attempting to explain how it had happened, as though the mechanics of the betrayal were something I needed to understand in order to move forward. I read every message. I responded to none of them. One message arrived about 6 weeks after the mediation. It was longer than the others. It started with, "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want to be honest with you about some things." And then Tanya wrote, in her own words, something that I had already known from the timeline Patricia had shown me, but that hit differently seeing it in her own handwriting. She told me it had started before she ever admitted to herself what it was. She said she had told herself for months that it was just a friendship, just closeness, just comfort in a period when she was lonely and lost. She said she had not planned it. She said she had not wanted to want him. What she did not say, not in that message or any other, was that she had found a way to stop. What she did not say was that at any point in those 3 years she had chosen me. What she did not say was that the woman who held my hand in that church and whispered that Marcus was the luckiest man alive had done anything other than play a long and comfortable role in something that was destroying me slowly from the inside. I read that message. I set my phone down. I walked to my mother's kitchen window, and I stood there looking at the backyard for a long time. My mother came and stood beside me. She didn't ask what I was reading. She just stood there. And after a while she said, "You know what I always told you about forgiveness?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Forgiveness is for you, not for them. You forgive so you can put it down, so you can walk without carrying it. But forgiveness doesn't mean proximity. It doesn't mean you owe anybody access to you after what they did with the access they had." I thought about that for a long time. What I did with Tanya, in the end, was nothing dramatic. No confrontation. No final conversation where I said all the things I could have said. No tearful goodbye, no screaming match, no scene of any kind. I simply withdrew. I stopped being reachable. I removed myself from shared family group chats quietly enough that it took people a few days to notice. I did not attend family events where I knew she would be present. I did not send a message explaining my absence, or justifying it, or seeking permission for it from anyone. I was simply gone from her life in the same quiet, total way that she had been absent from mine for 3 years while standing right beside me. Some family members had opinions about this. Of course they did. My family is large and opinionated and accustomed to everyone being in everyone else's business. There were phone calls to my mother. There were suggestions that I was being too hard, that family was family, that these things happened and needed to be worked through. My mother, to her eternal credit, told each of these people exactly the same thing. Renee is handling her life the way she sees fit, and that is not up for discussion. I love my mother more than I can say. Marcus and Tanya's relationship, for those who are curious about such things, did not survive the fallout of discovery. I learned this not from either of them, but from a cousin on a different branch of the family, who felt I deserved to know. Whatever they had built in secret, whatever had felt worth destroying my marriage for, apparently did not hold up well under the weight of consequence and daylight. They had been together, apparently, for several months after I left, and then quietly, and without any announcement that I heard of, they were not. I want to be careful about how I talk about that information, because I know what you might be expecting me to say. You might be expecting me to say it felt good. You might be expecting me to say I felt vindicated, or satisfied, or that justice had been served by their relationship failing. The truth is more complicated than that. What I felt, when I heard, was something closer to tiredness than triumph. Not the tiredness of defeat. I had not been defeated, but the tiredness that comes after a very long fight, when you finally put down your arms and realize you are still standing. The quiet exhaustion of a woman who has been strong for so long that when the moment comes to finally stop being strong, she doesn't quite know what to do with the stillness. I cried that night. For the first time since all of it began, I cried. Not with grief exactly, not with rage, with something that felt like the final release of something I had been holding in my chest for months, without fully knowing it was there. My mother heard me from her room. She came and sat on the edge of my bed and did not say a word. She simply took my hand and held it. We sat like that for a long time. In the months that followed, I rebuilt. That is the only word for it. Not recovered. Recovery implies a return to a previous state. and I was not interested in returning to anything. I rebuilt into something different. Something I understand now was always there, waiting for me to need it badly enough to find it. I went back to work with a different kind of focus. The kind of focus that comes when you stop dividing your attention between your job and someone else's comfort, someone else's needs, someone else's business that you were running for free while believing it was a partnership. I applied for a promotion I had talked myself out of pursuing for 2 years because Marcus had subtly, consistently suggested that the timing wasn't right, that we were building something together, that my energy was needed in a different direction. The raise was significant. My manager, a woman named Denise, who had been watching me operate below my capacity for longer than I knew, called me into her office when the decision was made and said, "I've been waiting for you to want this." I started running in the mornings. Not because I wanted to be smaller, or because I was punishing myself, or because I was trying to become a different version of myself as some kind of revenge body narrative. I started running because I discovered that the particular kind of thinking I needed to do, the long, slow, patient kind, happened most clearly when my body was in motion. I would leave my mother's house before sunrise and run through the quiet streets of the neighborhood I had grown up in, and I would think, not frantically, not obsessively, but with the kind of deliberate intention that was becoming my primary mode of operating in the world. I found an apartment. It took me 4 months to find the right one, and I was not rushed. I was no longer someone who made major decisions from urgency or from someone else's timeline. I looked at 11 apartments before I found the one I wanted. It was a 2-bedroom in a building with a rooftop and a doorman, and large south-facing windows that filled the living room with afternoon light. It was the most expensive apartment I had ever lived in. It was also the first place that had ever been entirely, completely mine. I moved in on a Saturday. My mother helped me. We spent the day arranging furniture and hanging curtains, and at the end of it she stood in the middle of my living room with her hands on her hips and looked around and said, "This looks like you." I said, "It does, doesn't it?" We ordered dinner and ate it on the floor because I only had 2 chairs and one of them was still in a box, and we laughed together in the easy way of women who have come through something hard and come out on the other side still standing, still whole, still capable of laughing on the floor of a half-furnished apartment at the end of a long and honest day. That night, after my mother had gone home, I sat alone in my new living room in the quiet, and I thought about who I was now. Not who I had been before Marcus, and not who I had tried to be during the marriage, and not the wounded version of myself that had moved into my mother's house with barely held composure and silent tears in the mornings. I thought about who I was right now, in this moment, in this apartment that was mine. I was 31 years old. I had been through something that would have undone a lot of people. I was not undone. I had a career that was finally operating at the level I was capable of. I had a home that felt like me. I had a mother who was my most steadfast person. I had friends, not many but real ones, the kind who had shown up in the preceding months with food and presence and honesty, the kind you keep. I had lost a husband who was not who I believed him to be. I had lost a cousin who had never been who I believed her to be. What I had not lost was myself. That is the thing I most want you to understand about this story, because I know how these stories can sound from the outside. I know that the revenge narrative, the woman done wrong narrative, can sometimes flatten the woman at the center of it into something one-dimensional. The wronged party, the victim who becomes victorious, the before and after. And I am not interested in being one-dimensional. I am not interested in being a narrative arc. I am a full person who went through a full experience and came out of it changed in ways that are not entirely reducible to the fact that I won a mediation or that their relationship fell apart. What changed in me was not only strength, although I did find that. What changed was something quieter, and I think more permanent. A willingness to trust my own perceptions. A refusal to explain away the evidence of my own senses out of loyalty to a story I wanted to be true. A commitment to myself, to my own knowing, my own comfort, my own life, that I had been placing second for years without fully understanding I was doing it. I understand it now. Marcus reached out to me one more time, about 8 months after everything was final. A single text message that said only, "I hope you're doing well." No request, no further explanation, no attempt to open a conversation. I read it, I thought about it for perhaps 30 seconds, and then I put my phone in my pocket and went back to whatever I had been doing before it arrived, which I no longer remember, because it was compared to what I had built and where I was standing, perfectly ordinary. Which is to say, it was mine. Which is to say, it was good. There are women who will read this story or hear this story and recognize something in it. Maybe not the specific details. Maybe you have never come home to find your husband and your cousin in your own guest room. Maybe your betrayal wore a different face. Maybe it was a friend, a sister, a business partner, or a parent. Maybe it was not a romantic betrayal at all, but the particular kind of hurt that comes when someone you trusted completely with the full weight of who you are decides that weight is less important than what they want. If you recognize this story, in whatever form your version of it took, I want you to hear this. The way they did it tells you everything about who they are, and what you do next will tell you everything about who you are. You do not have to be dramatic. You do not have to make scenes or issue public statements or perform your pain for anyone's benefit. You do not have to be loud about it. You just have to decide what kind of woman you are going to be, and then you have to be her, every single day, quietly, completely, without apology. The rest has a way of working itself out. My name is Renee, and that is my story. 18 months. That is how much time passed between the day I walked out of my own house and left my key on the kitchen counter, and the morning I want to tell you about now. 18 months sounds like a long time when you are standing at the beginning of it, looking down its length the way you look down a road that disappears into the horizon. It sounds like more than enough time to heal, to rebuild, to become whoever you are becoming. People say time heals everything, and they mean it kindly, and they are not entirely wrong. But what they leave out is that time does not do the healing by itself. Time is just the container. What you put inside it is what matters. What you choose to do with each day, each morning, each quiet evening when the old grief surfaces unexpectedly, and you have to decide, again, what kind of woman you are going to be. I put a great deal inside those 18 months. I threw myself into my career in a way I had not permitted myself to do during the marriage. Not because Marcus had explicitly forbidden it, he had not been that obvious about it, but there is a particular kind of subtle diminishment that some men practice on the women they live with. A consistent, low-level messaging that says, your ambitions are fine, but not as important as mine. Your goals are valid but secondary. Your potential is something we can get to eventually, after we have finished building what I am building. It does not always come in the form of direct statements. Sometimes it comes in the form of a sigh when you mention working late. Sometimes it comes in the form of a question about whether you really need that particular professional development course right now, given everything on the family plate. Sometimes it comes in the form of a silence that speaks volumes about whose career is the real priority in this household. I had absorbed that messaging more than I realized. I understood this only in retrospect, the way you understand many things only after you have removed yourself from the environment that was shaping you and can finally see clearly what was happening. Once I was out, once it was just me and my choices and my time and my energy, with no one else's comfort to manage and no one else's ego to protect, I moved fast. I had been working as an office manager when I met Marcus. I had been good at it, genuinely good, with a particular talent for systems and processes, and the kind of organizational intelligence that keeps large operations running smoothly and invisibly. But I had always known it was not the ceiling for me. I had known it, and I had not pursued it. First because the timing never felt right, and then because the timing kept not feeling right. And eventually I had stopped examining why the timing never felt right, and simply accepted the not rightness as a condition of my life. The promotion I received shortly after the separation was real, and it was meaningful, and I was grateful for it. But it was also, I understood, only the beginning. I enrolled in a project management certification program 6 months after moving into my apartment. Evening classes, 2 nights a week. I sat in those classes with people who were 10 years younger than me and people who were 15 years older than me, and I was not self-conscious about either because I had recently been through something that had permanently recalibrated my sense of what was worth being self-conscious about and what was not. I finished the certification in 4 months. I applied it immediately in my role, and the results were visible and measurable. And my manager Denise noticed and said so in my annual review, which was the best review I had ever received, and which resulted in a compensation adjustment that was, frankly, overdue. I started looking at what else was possible. There was a director-level position that opened at my company 9 months after my separation. I had never applied for a director role before. I had always found a reason not to. Not qualified enough, not ready enough, not the right time. I looked at that job posting and I sat with the familiar voice that said not yet, and I examined it carefully and I asked it to show me its reasoning, and it could not produce anything convincing, and so I applied. The interview process was 4 rounds. I prepared for each one with the same focused energy I had brought to the mediation with Marcus. I researched, I organized, I anticipated objections, and prepared for them. I walked into each interview the way I had walked into that conference room. Back straight, composure settled, knowing exactly what I was bringing to the table, and prepared to articulate it clearly. I got the job. The morning Denise called to tell me I was in my kitchen making coffee. I listened to her words and I said, "Thank you, and I will see you Monday." And then I hung up the phone and I stood in my kitchen in the morning light and I let myself feel it. Not performed joy, not the kind you put on for an audience, just the quiet, private satisfaction of a woman who bet on herself and won. I called my mother. She cried. I almost cried but held it together, because one of us needed to, and she was already well into it. She said Doris always knew. I said, "Mama, you are Doris." She laughed through her tears and said, "That's what I mean." I want to tell you about my apartment during this period because I think it matters. Because the space a woman creates for herself when she finally has the room to create it tells you a great deal about who she actually is, underneath everything she has been shaped into by other people's needs and other people's aesthetics and other people's visions of what a home should look like. My apartment was warm and specific and a little unconventional. I had painted the living room walls a deep green that people sometimes raised an eyebrow at until they sat in it for 20 minutes and understood why I had chosen it. I had bookshelves on 2 walls, filled with books I had always meant to read and was finally reading, and books I had loved for years and kept returning to. I had a writing desk by the south-facing window where the afternoon light came in, and I sat at that desk in the evenings after work, and sometimes in the early mornings before it, and I wrote things that were only for me, processing and thinking, and sometimes simply describing the texture of a day that had been particularly good or particularly hard. Not the adequate cooking of a busy woman managing a household, but real cooking, intentional cooking, the kind where you take your time and use good ingredients and treat the making of a meal as something worth doing well. I cooked for myself on Sunday afternoons, and I cooked for my mother when she came to visit, and occasionally I cooked for the small circle of friends who had remained and expanded during this period. One of those friends was a woman named Claudette, who I had known since college, and who had, during the worst of the separation period, shown up at my mother's house on a random Tuesday with a bottle of wine and a very clear agenda of not talking about Marcus at all, and instead talking about everything else, books and travel and bad movies, and the particular absurdity of being a black woman in your 30s, navigating a world that was constantly surprised by your competence and your duty and your refusal to be diminished by either. Claudette was funny and honest and did not tiptoe around difficult things, which I valued enormously during a period when a lot of people in my life were tiptoeing. She became one of the people I trusted most. Another was a woman named Portia, who I met in my project management certification class. She was 43, had come through her own significant upheaval several years prior, a business partnership that had dissolved badly, taking a chunk of her financial security with it, and had rebuilt with the particular clarity of someone who had been forced to understand exactly what they were capable of. Portia and I recognized something in each other almost immediately. We studied together, complained about the coursework together, celebrated completion together, and remained friends after. These women, Claudette and Portia and my mother and Denise and a few others, were the architecture of my recovery. Not scaffolding. Scaffolding implies something temporary, something that gets removed once the real structure is standing. They were structural. They were load-bearing. They were the reason that the rebuilding I did during those 18 months was solid in a way that rebuilding done alone rarely is. I want to be honest about something now. About the parts of those 18 months that were not triumph and forward motion and professionally successful and surrounded by good women. There were hard mornings, more of them than I have described, more of them than I will fully describe now, because some things a woman holds privately, and there is no obligation to inventory every difficult hour for the benefit of a narrative. There were mornings when I woke up at 4 and lay in my carefully chosen apartment, with its deep green walls and its good books and its proof of my own competence and self-sufficiency. And I felt the loss. Not the loss of Marcus as he actually was. I had processed that with enough clarity to understand that what I had lost was a fiction, a person I had constructed from incomplete information and a great deal of hope. No. What I felt on those difficult mornings was the loss of the life I had believed I was building, the particular grief of a woman who was exactly where she had been working toward: partnership, home, future, belonging, and then was not. That grief is real, and it is not the same as missing the person who caused it. And I think it is important to say that clearly, because the two things get confused. You can grieve the life you thought you were going to have without grieving the person who convinced you it was coming. You can mourn the version of yourself who trusted so completely without wishing you could go back to being her. You can sit with the loss of something that turned out to be built on false ground without wishing the false ground had held. I sat with all of those things on those 4 o'clock mornings. I sat with them and I breathed through them. And when they passed, as they always did eventually, I got up. I made coffee. I sat at my desk by the window, or I went out for a run through the still dark streets, and I put one foot in front of the other, and I kept going. That is all recovery ever actually is: keeping going, on the hard mornings and the good ones, especially on the hard ones. I was 14 months out from the separation when I saw Marcus. I had wondered sometimes whether this would happen and how I would feel when it did. Atlanta is a large city, but it is also in certain ways a small town, particularly within the communities and circuits that overlap. I had thought about the possibility of running into him, turned it over, tried to prepare myself emotionally for it, without being dramatic about it, without giving the hypothetical scenario more space in my mind than it deserved. Even so, when it actually happened, it was different from anything I had imagined. I was at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning. It was October, which meant it was one of those Atlanta October days that feel like a gift. Cool and clear and golden. The kind of day that makes you understand why people fall in love with the South, in spite of everything. I was carrying a canvas bag with tomatoes and fresh bread in it, and I was thinking about what I was going to make for dinner, and I was not thinking about Marcus at all. And then I looked up from a display of sweet potatoes, and he was there, 20 feet away, standing at a booth that sold honey and jams, holding a small jar up to read the label, wearing a jacket I did not recognize, which meant he had bought it in the time since I had known him, which was a small thing that for some reason landed with unexpected weight. He had not seen me yet. I had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do. I could turn and walk in the other direction. I could stay where I was and wait to see if he noticed me. I could walk toward him deliberately. I stayed where I was. He looked up from the jar. He scanned the market the way people do when they are not looking for anything specific. And then his eyes landed on me and stopped. We looked at each other from 20 feet away across a Saturday morning farmer's market in October in Atlanta, and neither of us moved for what was probably 5 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then he raised a hand in the small, careful wave of a man who is not sure of his welcome and knows it. I nodded, once, brief, not cold, but not warm, simply acknowledging that I had seen him and that the acknowledgement was all he was going to get. He nodded back. He put the jar of honey down. He turned and walked in the other direction. I stood where I was for another moment. I took a breath. I looked down at the sweet potatoes in front of me, selected 2 good ones, put them in my bag, and went to find the eggs. That evening I sat at my desk, and I thought about what I had felt in those seconds of seeing him. I tried to be honest with myself about it, the way I had learned to be honest with myself about difficult things. I took an inventory. There was no rage. That surprised me less than it might have once. The rage had burned itself out gradually over the preceding 14 months, converted slowly into something more useful. There was no residual longing, no pull toward the version of the story where things had been different. There was something that might have been sadness, brief and distant, like seeing the ruins of a building you used to live in, and feeling the shadow of what it was, without wanting to be back inside it. And underneath all of that, underneath the sadness and the absence of rage and the absence of longing, there was something I had to sit with for a moment before I could name it. Relief. Not the relief of someone who has escaped something, the deeper relief of someone who has arrived somewhere. The relief of a woman who has looked at the evidence of her own life, where she is living, how she is working, who is around her, who she is when she is alone, and found it not only survivable, but genuinely good. Not perfect, not without loss or grief or the complex ongoing work of being a full human being who has been through difficult things, but good, solid, hers. I was relieved because seeing Marcus and feeling nothing but a brief shadow of sadness told me something about where I had arrived that I had not been entirely sure of until that moment. It told me that the 18 months of work had done what I had been quietly hoping they would do. Not erased anything. I did not want erasure and would not have trusted it if I had found it, but integrated it, made it part of the full story of who I was rather than the defining wound at the center of everything. I was whole. Not the same whole I had been before. That version of whole was gone and I did not mourn it. A different whole, a more honest one that had been tested in a very specific and very thorough way and had held. I wrote that down at my desk that evening. Just those words, I am whole, and then I closed the notebook and I went to the kitchen and I made dinner with the sweet potatoes and the tomatoes and the bread, and I ate it at my own table, in my own apartment, in my own good quiet life, and it tasted like exactly what it was. I called my mother that night after dinner. This was not unusual. I called her most evenings, the way daughters who understand what they have call their mothers whenever they can. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. I told her I had seen Marcus at the market. There was a pause on her end, the particular pause of a mother who is waiting to understand what kind of conversation this is going to be, before she decides how to enter it. I said, I'm fine, Mama. I meant it. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, tell me about the market. What was good today? And so I told her. I told her about the tomatoes and the bread and the sweet potatoes and the honey stand and the particular quality of the October light and the woman who had been selling handmade quilts in colors so beautiful they had stopped me for a full minute just to look at them. I told her about the coffee I had bought from a young man who was clearly new to the booth and slightly overwhelmed and who had gotten my order wrong and then correct, and who had given me an apologetic smile that made me laugh. I told her about all the ordinary beautiful details of an ordinary beautiful morning in my ordinary beautiful life, and my mother listened to every word in the way she had always listened to me, with her full attention and her full heart. And when I finished, she said, that sounds like a really good morning, baby. I said it was. She said, you sound like yourself. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about what it meant to sound like yourself. Whether the self you sound like is a fixed thing or a living thing, whether it changes or whether something at the center of it stays constant, regardless of what happens around it. I thought about who I had been at 26 when I met Marcus, and who I was now at 31, having come through everything I had come through, and whether those two women were the same person, or different people, or something more complicated than either. I said, I think I sound like someone I'm still getting to know. Not the small, polite laugh she used when something was mildly amusing. The real one, the full one, the laugh that I had grown up with, and that still, at 31, made something in me relax completely. She said, well, honey, in my experience that is the best possible person to sound like. We talked for another hour, about nothing consequential, about everything important, about her garden and a book she was reading, and a neighbor who had done something she found mildly outrageous and wanted to describe in full detail. About a trip we had been loosely planning to visit a cousin in New Orleans that we needed to actually commit to. About what I was thinking of cooking for Sunday dinner and whether she would come over, and the answer being, of course she would come over. When had she ever said no to Sunday dinner? When we finally said goodnight, it was almost 10 o'clock. I turned off the lights in my apartment one by one, and I got into bed, and I lay in the dark, in the quiet, and I thought about nothing in particular for a while. Just the day. Just the light, just the fullness of the ordinary good life I was living. I have been asked, since all of this, whether I regret the marriage, whether I would go back and do something differently if I could, whether the ending makes the beginning feel like a mistake. The answer I always give is the honest one, which is that I do not think in those terms anymore. Regret assumes that the life you have now is worse than the life you would have had if things had been different, and I am not convinced that is true. I am not convinced that the version of me who had not gone through this would be as clear, as focused, as genuinely rooted in herself as the version of me who did. I am not suggesting that betrayal is a gift. It is not, and I would not insult anyone who has lived through it by framing it that way. But I am saying that what you do with it can become something. That the clarity it forces on you, if you are willing to sit with it honestly, can become a foundation. I am built on something real now. Something I built myself with my own hands out of materials I chose. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything. My name is Renee, and I want you to hear me when I say this. Whatever they did, you are not diminished by it. Whatever they took, they could not take what you are made of. Whatever lies they told, whatever trust they broke, whatever version of your life they quietly, steadily dismantled without your knowledge. None of that gets to define you. Not unless you let it, not unless you hand it that power. Take your time, think clearly, move deliberately, know what you are worth, and do not accept less than that from the people around you, or from the systems you navigate, or from the voice inside your own head when it gets tired and starts to negotiate downward. Build what is yours, live what is yours, protect what is yours, and when someone tells you that you will not make it through this, when the voice says it is too much, when the grief says it is too heavy, when the morning says it is too hard, I want you to think of a woman named Renee, standing in a farmer's market in October, holding sweet potatoes and tomatoes and good bread, watching a man she used to love walk away, and feeling nothing but the relief of her own whole and solid life. It is possible.